Tonight, a story that will shock and dismay you, for it's a charge of a CIA cover-up. One man's report of America's last unhappy days in South Vietnam, the evacuation from Vietnam. You've been reading stories about it the last 2 days in your newspapers, but no one has yet heard directly from the ex-CIA man responsible for this charge of cover-up. He was the senior intelligence analyst of North Vietnamese strategy for the United States Central Intelligence Agency in Vietnam. He was awarded the CIA's Medal of Merit for his work in Vietnam. Frank Snepp is his name. Now 34 years old, Frank Snepp told us he joined the CIA in 1968 to avoid the draft. But he wound up doing 2 tours of duty in Vietnam for the CIA. Everyone who works for the agency signs an oath that he will submit for prior clearance and censorship any public comment he intends to make about anything he has learned inside the agency. Frank Snepp will tell us why he now sees fit to break that oath. A word about the circumstances surrounding this report. Snepp came to 60 Minutes several months ago to tell us about his charges and about a book he was writing on the subject, a book called A Decent Interval. Because the CIA had gone to court in the past to suppress uncensored comment by a former agent, 60 Minutes secretly filmed the interview you're about to see. In order to understand fully just what it is that Snepp is about to disclose and the seriousness of his charges against the CIA and other individuals, let us first go back to April 29th, 1975, the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather filling in for Walter Cronkite.
South Vietnam now is under communist control. Early today, beginning with a jeep load of rather ragtag Viet Cong soldiers, then truck after truck of heavily armed North Vietnamese regular troops, the communists entered Saigon in force.
Then a report from Saigon streets by correspondent Ed Bradley.
The crowds of Americans and other foreigners lined up at installations around Saigon waiting for buses was the cue. It told the Vietnamese that this was the end of the line. For most of those who wanted to leave their country, this would be their last chance. Some Americans who pushed towards the bus tried to pull their Vietnamese wives and children along with them. There were desperate scenes with families separated and crying out for help, pleading not to be left behind, clutching at the last straw of hope. We all decided to try and reach the United States Embassy. We had to push and shove our way through a crowd of several hundred Vietnamese trying to scale the walls, only to be knocked back by U.S. Marines. Once inside the compound, it was just a matter of waiting your turn for a helicopter to take you to one of the ships on station off the Vietnamese coast. The American fleet had been having problems since the start of the evacuation. South Vietnamese pilots just hovered long enough to unload their passengers and then headed to the side of the ships and just jumped out with their life vests to be picked up by U.S. sailors, their helicopters crashing into the sea.
That was the story we heard and saw on the United States' last day in Vietnam. But what was the real story? Snepp concludes in his book, in terms of squandered lives, blown secrets, and the betrayal of agents, friends, and collaborators, the CIA's handling of the evacuation from Vietnam was an institutional disgrace. Who were the people left behind? Snepp says they were hardly faceless Vietnamese just trying to get out. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, he says, were men and women who had worked for the CIA, for the U.S. Embassy. They were people who were exposed for years to some of the United States' closely held national security information.
For instance, we left behind on the tarmac or outside the walls of the embassy 400 to 500 members of Saigon's Special Police Force. We had trained them. They were in imminent jeopardy from the communists. We also left behind about 400 to 1,200 members of the CIO, the Central Intelligence Organization. We'd also trained them. We also left behind about 30,000 people who had worked for the Phoenix program.
The Phoenix program
which was the counter-terrorist operation mounted against the communists during the mid-1960s under CIA direction.
Collaborators, defectors, translators,
clerks, radio operators, police collaborators.
Left behind.
Left behind often just outside the embassy wall. In other words, we got the wrong Vietnamese. All these promises by the administration that we would get high-risk Vietnamese out of the country, they went by the board in the chaos of the evacuation.
When the CIA abandoned play coup earlier, you write, in their haste to remove themselves, they committed a host of sins for which any intelligence operative should be drawn and quartered.
That's right.
Specify.
In their haste to get out of the path of the advancing North Vietnamese army, they left documents behind. And they also left behind one of our primary agents. In other words, the CIA guys did not do their job. They bugged out.
You describe all of this leaving behind of people who had worked with us or for us, Vietnamese, a callous act of betrayal on the part of the CIA?
In some cases, betrayal was involved. We saved the people in the white skin. We left behind the Vietnamese.
You say in your book that the massive files of the South Vietnamese Central Intelligence Organization, identifying defectors, collaborators, prisoners, anyone who had helped us or seemed likely to, were left behind.
That's correct. When the North Vietnamese rolled into Saigon on April 30th, Commander-in-Chief found these files intact. If an experienced counterintelligence operative, say for the Soviet KGB or for North Vietnamese intelligence, put all this data together, he could begin to develop a picture of how the United States operates in a crisis. And this is strategic intelligence, any way you cut it.
What you are painting, Mr. Snepp, is a picture of an absolute CIA botch at the end in Vietnam.
It was a failure of leadership. There were a lot of young operatives on the ground who violated or overstepped the orders from the men on high in an effort to save the Vietnamese who depended on them.
Then who are you pointing at? Thomas Polgar, CIA station chief in Saigon?
Indeed, Mike, Mr. Polgar must bear primary responsibility because it was his job to organize this evacuation for the CIA.
Are there others?
Absolutely.
Who?
Director Colby.
CIA Director William Colby.
Who failed to perceive the need for intensified evacuation planning in time.
And what about Henry Kissinger?
Well, there's no question that during Saigon's final days, March and April of 1975, Kissinger was making policy. And he was abusing people who disagreed with him. During a Washington Special Action Group session in early April, Schlesinger said, we must begin this evacuation now.
James Schlesinger, the Secretary
of Defense. And Kissinger said, well, you're just trying to cover your ass. And he did the same thing with Colby. Kissinger accused him of trying to cover his ass.
You know this for a fact? How do you know this?
From people who were in the session.
The evacuation was botched, says Snepp, because the United States waited too long to get it underway. And Henry Kissinger, he says, was at the root of it. Kissinger was trying to get additional money out of Congress to help the South Vietnamese to hold out. Therefore, he held off on evacuation plans.
When it appeared finally by mid-April that this additional aid was superfluous, Saigon was going down the drain anyway, the South Vietnamese army was disintegrating all across the country, then another gambit was tried, and that involved the Soviets.
What happened, according to Snepp, is that Kissinger approached Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin to see if the Soviets wouldn't intercede with the North Vietnamese to permit the Americans enough time for a safe and graceful exit from Vietnam. In other words, Kissinger was saying to the Soviets, look, you help us to get a negotiated settlement in Saigon.
Or at least free time for an evacuation.
And they led him to believe
that all this was possible. That is correct, Mike.
And Kissinger bought their story.
He bought their story.
Because he wanted so much for the negotiation to work, coalition to government to work.
For some kind of political deal to work, to bail Saigon out.
But according to Snepp, all this hope for a negotiated settlement and a chance for the Americans to get out gracefully, all this flew in the face of intelligence received by the CIA in Saigon. You had specific information that the North Vietnamese would not agree to a negotiated peace with a coalition government, but wanted to push right on to Saigon.
That's correct.
From your
top agent
inside the North Vietnamese leadership. You made that report.
I made it twice because Washington and Polgar and the rest, they were not accepting our intelligence. That I met with the agent directly, and again he told me the same thing. There is no chance for negotiated settlement. He was right. Right down to the airstrike, Mike. We suffered an airstrike on the final day, on the 28th, I should say. He had predicted that.
How did you get a spy in the top North Vietnamese leadership?
He had been implanted a deep penetration, a man who had been there for years, very trusted. And he would bring out information regularly, and he had helped us predict the Tet Offensive of 1968.
Didn't do us much good.
Didn't do us much good because the analysts back in Washington chose to ignore that information. Just as the analysts at the top levels of the U.S. government in the final days of Saigon chose to disregard his information.
You had spies in Thieu's cabinet.
That's right. We had not only spies, we had the cabinet bugged so that the South Vietnamese could hardly cough without our picking up the data.
The North Vietnamese had spies in Thieu's cabinet.
They did a far better job of monitoring Thieu's cabinet than we did because they believed their intelligence. We didn't believe ours.
Why?
Go back to the old problem of wishful thinking at the top, Mike, and the problems that Kissinger was having. His desperate determination to keep us faithful to an ally to the end.
Another factor in the confusion at the end, says Snepp, was the unique character of U.S. Ambassador to Saigon, Graham Martin.
Martin was a cold warrior in the old stripe. He could not conceive of being beaten by communists. He had lost a son in Vietnam. His life was fraught with all sorts of tragedy. And he was determined to make this last stand.
On April 10th, to a group of American businessmen in Saigon, did he not say, reinvest your money in Saigon?
Well, that statement came from the deputy chief of mission, but he was echoing Martin. Reinvest, he said. Saigon is as sound as the American dollar. That was only 3 weeks before the collapse.
You say that in his effort to shore up the Thieu government, he failed to report to Washington on the slipping morale of the Vietnamese army and of the intolerable corruption inside the South Vietnamese government.
When Ambassador Martin arrived in Saigon, he distributed a memo to the embassy. And in the memo he said, "Gentlemen, we will not engage in any proctological examinations of the South Vietnamese body politic." This led a lot of us to conclude that reporting on corruption would simply not be acceptable in the front office. And so that kind of reporting began to dry up.
What about security in the countryside?
Same thing happened.
Because?
Because, Mike, you couldn't admit that South Vietnamese morale was bad or that security was terrible in the countryside and still hope to rally a reluctant Congress behind a new aid bill. This was always the thrust of Martin's policy. We've got to rally Congress.
Well, was he, I know it's difficult to say, was he consciously lying, or was he just doing a diplomat's job of trying to get the job done no matter what?
Well, Ambassador Martin used to say from time to time, we must stretch the facts to fit the case. I wouldn't say Ambassador Martin was lying. He was simply stretching the facts to fit the case.
You say that almost till the end, Ambassador Martin held out the hope that perhaps if the Congress turned down aid for South Vietnam, Saudi Arabia might pick up the tab. Where in the world did that story come from?
I was sitting with the station chief, Tom Polgar, in his office at the end of March, and he said, "Oh, we now have a chance. We now have a chance because the Saudi Arabians like Kissinger, King Faisal likes Kissinger, and he's agreed to give money to Kissinger to help out the South Vietnamese."
You mean the Congress
as a personal favor to Henry Kissinger.
According to Snepp, even after King Faisal was assassinated by a disaffected young relative, Ambassador Martin still had hopes for aid from Saudi Arabia.
As a matter of fact, Mike, as late as April 17th, only 2 weeks before the collapse, Martin was urging Kissinger by cable to revive this idea with the Saudi Arabians. As a matter of fact, the same thing was done with the Iranians. We were seeking aid from the Iranians to help the South Vietnamese.
Ambassador Martin has repeatedly justified his holding off on evacuation by claiming first that he had strong hopes for a negotiated settlement, and second, that a premature evacuation would have sown panic in Saigon.
I believe Ambassador Martin was overdrawing the danger of panic in the streets. He began planting horror stories in the press around Saigon concerning a possible bloodbath. Now, Martin was trying, I think in this respect, to generate sympathy for the South Vietnamese cause abroad by suggesting the communists were eating little children, in effect.
Saying that Martin planted these stories in Saigon with the Saigon reporters?
Exactly.
The U.S. reporters?
That's right. The whole idea of a bloodbath was conjured out of thin air. We had no intelligence to indicate the South Vietnamese were facing a bloodbath.
To what degree was the press had by the United States government in Vietnam?
Kai's Beach of the Chicago Daily News, George MacArthur of the Los Angeles Times, Robert Chaplin of the New Yorker, Bud Merrick of U.S. News and World Report, all of these reporters were favored journalists. We would leak to them on a selected basis, draw them into our trust, into our confidence, and then we could shape their reporting through further leaks because they trusted us.
For instance, says Snepp, in the final days, the U.S. Embassy continued to leak stories pushing the chances for a negotiated settlement.
And one particular reporter who bid all this hook, line, and sinker was Malcolm Brown of the New York Times. He and Polgar became very close during Saigon's final days, to the point that we were using Brown on April 28th to pass messages to the communist delegation at Tan Son Nhut. And again, Brown was not operating as a CIA operative or agent or some such. He was simply, I guess, behaving as he thought a good citizen ought to behave.
And was he printing the information which you were passing back and forth?
That's right.
So he was simply a good reporter with a hell of a source.
That's the way you could put it, yes. The sources were giving him disinformation, to use a Soviet term, and he was printing disinformation.
And how was he to know? He was getting it from the ambassador and the station chief.
It would have been impossible for him to know.
Do you know of American journalists paid by the CIA?
I know of foreign journalists paid by the CIA, whose stories appear in the New York Times and various other respected newspapers.
Who?
I cannot identify them because, as I have pointed out in the book, I am against dealing with sources and methods explicitly.
You mean this is going on today?
It continues today.
Bylines in the Times, New York Times.
In various newspapers, that's correct.
But what dismayed Snepp most of all after the evacuation was the attempt by those responsible at the top to put a different face on what had transpired. What you're talking about is a calculated cover-up.
That's right, Mike. And not merely a cover-up, but also a whitewash. Director Colby was leaking to select or favored journalists his version of what had taken place. This was also going on in the State Department and in the Pentagon. Their version of what had taken place glossed over the mistakes.
Snepp says it was on the insistence of Henry Kissinger that many of those government officials leaked material to selected reporters.
Kissinger said that the agency and various other departments of government should open their files to certain journalists.
What journalists? What journalists?
Mike, I won't get into names because I happen to like the journalists involved, and they were simply operating as good journalists. They were picking up a good story where they could get it.
Why would he want them to be briefed?
Because I think Kissinger wanted to project his version of the collapse to make sure that he came out not as a villain, not as responsible for what had taken place.
You say William Colby met with one of them and provided a compilation of our top secret reporting from Vietnam, including sources and methods.
That's right, Mike. Sometime in early 1976, Colby turned over to the reporters in question this document. This document is a compilation of all of Colby's briefings before WASAG, the Crisis Management Group, and it is designed, the selections are designed to put Colby in a very good light.
It originally said at the bottom, top secret sensitive.
That's right, and that was the way it was shown to the reporters in question. That was the way it was shown to them. It was still a classified document.
You're talking about the head of the CIA, the director.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Snepp's familiarity with events that transpired in Saigon and Washington, and even in Hanoi during the Vietnam War, gave him insight and knowledge shared by few others. He talked of the Paris peace talks in 1971 and 72. According to your book, during the time that he was negotiating the peace settlement with the North Vietnamese, Kissinger did it with such secrecy that even the CIA, you people, had to find out what Kissinger was up to from CIA spies inside North Vietnam's leadership?
That's right. We first learned of the secret negotiations, or the progress of the secret negotiations Kissinger was conducting with Le Duc Tho from our best agent inside the Communist command. As a matter of fact, Kissinger so misled the South Vietnamese that on the very day of the ceasefire, President Thieu didn't even have a complete copy of the Paris Accord. He didn't know what Kissinger had negotiated for him.
I asked Snepp about another story in his book. The CIA wanted to kidnap North Vietnamese leaders.
Kissinger, during the latter stages of the Paris negotiations in 72 and late 71, was anxious to find some way to get those negotiations off dead center. At his direction, we, in cooperation with the Pentagon, put together contingency studies on how to kidnap the North Vietnamese leadership. It was a rather amusing study because we couldn't even identify where the North Vietnamese lived, much less kidnap them.
You recount another story about another ambassador, Ellsworth Bunker, financing or offering to finance a campaign for General Duong Van Minh, Big Min, to run against President Thieu in 1971 for the presidency of South Vietnam?
The U.S. government would do almost anything in those days to legitimize Thieu's rule. In order to give the impression there was actual opposition to him, Ambassador Bunker went to Big Min, a neutralist leader, and offered to give him $3 million if he would run as a straw horse candidate, if you will.
And?
Against Thieu.
What did Min do?
Min said, "Why should I run and lose?" He said, "Well, I'm not going to take your money," and in effect kicked Bunker out of his office.
You write, among those responsible for the ultimate North Vietnamese victory, the spy in Thieu's entourage must rank high on the credit list. Can you specify who he was?
We think that there were 4 candidates, including the head of the Military Security Service, the South Vietnamese Counter-Espionage Service. We had never moved against these men. We had never recommended they be brought to trial because we had helped to promote their careers. And if we suddenly found them guilty of espionage, it would have been awfully embarrassing. Well, one of them betrayed us. One of them was a North Vietnamese spy.
Another story in the last days before the evacuation.
Up until the last minute, Mike, the South Vietnamese government was working to get out of the country its $220 million in gold, that which made up what remained of its national treasury. For a variety of reasons, this gold was never evacuated. One of the reasons it was not evacuated is the man who controlled it, the economics minister in the last Saigon regime, was working for North Vietnamese intelligence.
But other money was secretly taken out. For instance, says Snepp, in the chaotic hours of the evacuation, U.S. Embassy employees had been ordered to burn stacks of American money left over at the embassy.
It almost got burned up, Mike, but the fellows who were to do the burning absconded with some of the funds. They took it out under the dresses of their Vietnamese girlfriends.
In the amount of?
$80,000 to $90,000.
You know that for a fact?
I know this for a fact.
You were chosen to drive President Thieu to Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon on the night of his own evacuation from Saigon to Taiwan. What was that night like?
We showed up at the rendezvous point at Prime Minister Kim's house slightly after nightfall. There was all sorts of sporadic weapons fire out beyond the air base, and we were nervous as hell because we had gotten reports that Wen Cao Ki, was planning to assassinate Thieu. Well, as the evening progressed, Thieu finally showed up. He showed up in a gray Mercedes. As he got out, he was in a gray sharkskin suit, his hair slicked back, his face oiled. He looked like a model for a Far Eastern edition of Gentleman's Quarterly. In the meantime, several of his aides had run out of the woods with big suitcases. They just materialized out of nowhere. And we said, "Can we help you pack these suitcases in the back of the car?" No, we'll take care of it. And as they put the suitcases in to the back of the cars, we heard the tinkle of metal on metal, so like Chinese wind chimes.
What you're saying is that he was taking gold with him.
He'd shipped most of his gold out of the country in early April. This was simply what was left over.
There was talk that Marshal Key was involved in the drug business, not just in Vietnam, but in Southeast Asia. Would the CIA know about that?
These gentlemen at the top of the Thieu government and during Key's time were being protected by the embassy against investigations by American narcotics agents. The reason this was so, these officials were so important to us. We couldn't have them accused of trading in drugs. The CIA, in fact, frustrated various probes into the drug problem from time to time whenever an important agent, let's say, was involved. This is a very important point, Mike, because in recent years, the CIA has reporting responsibilities on the drug question abroad. There is a conflict of interest. Sometimes we don't want a drug trafficker arrested because he's operating as an agent, so the trafficker is not arrested.
Snepp says the CIA itself operated at times outside the law. In order to get more funds for its Vietnamese operations, it would trade on the money black market in Hong Kong.
To make those funds go further, we would deal on the black market in Hong Kong and get a much better rate in piastres. And then we could mount operations we might not have been able to otherwise. It was an economy measure, if you will. And it didn't seem to trouble CIA officials that went against the U.S. government's efforts to.
Was there corruption in the CIA in Vietnam?
In 1973, mid-73, CIA auditors in Saigon discovered that a very high-ranking agency official who was operating in the central part of the country had misused funds. He had not applied his operational funds to operations, to develop agent networks and what have you. Instead, he'd used them for God knows what. This is a very important case because the territory which he was responsible for is the territory where the communists struck first during the final offensive in 1975. And it is not too much to say that the CIA officers' corruption contributed to our intelligence failure. We weren't able to pinpoint what the communists were going to do in the highlands because we had never developed the agent networks.
And what happened to that agent?
He was called into Saigon, sent home, and then released from the CIA. But he was not prosecuted. He was never prosecuted because to do so would have been an embarrassment to the agency.
When Frank Snepp returned to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia after the evacuation, he wanted to tell the story of the debacle to his superiors.
When I came back from Saigon after the collapse, I asked to be allowed to do an after-action report detailing what had gone wrong. I was told no one was interested. Later, I was called in by the CIA's Inspector General, and he told me that he was putting together a document which Colby could use to fend off congressional probes into CIA conduct in Vietnam in the final days. Well, I figured this was not the kind of after-action report I wanted to be associated with.
They asked you to fill out an affidavit. You refused. What was in that affidavit?
The affidavit tried to attribute our mistakes to local enemy action. In other words, our failure to get people out, this document said, was due to local enemy action. I refused to sign that document because it simply wasn't true.
Finally, in January of 1976, Snepp resigned from the agency and began to write his book. All right, you have all these complaints about the CIA and the American evacuation, Mr. Snepp, and now you're going public. Why are you going public? You swore that you would not. You signed an oath that you would not go public.
That's right.
You signed that 16 September 1968.
That's right. If you read on in that, there is a clause there that requires or specifies that an officer can go and register his complaints with appropriate authorities in the agency. I tried to do this. I wanted not to go public. I wanted to do my after-action report on the inside and was rebuffed at every turn. I feel I have met my obligation. Also, I think the agency has made a mockery of the secrecy system with its select leaks to the press in its efforts to whitewash its role in the end. And for this reason, I regard those secrets as being declassified.
The CIA knows that you've been writing this book.
That's correct.
When they learned of your intention, what did they do?
They called several of my colleagues in the agency in, tried to squeeze information out of them, get them to inform on me, and in fact, it tried to force me to identify the publishers I had been in touch with in my preparations for writing this book. They called in a girl I had dated in the agency, threatened to fire her unless she informed on me. But this is standard practice.
To gain time, Snepp had all along assured the CIA he would submit his book to them for review and possible censorship, even though in the last few months at least he has had no intention of doing so. Have you told the CIA that you are not going to submit this for censorship?
No, I have not.
You really think the CIA does not know how far this has gone and the fact that you are talking to us?
I think if they did, Mike, I would have been enjoined. I think that they would have gotten a court order to silence me. I think it's also significant, and this is important, I think should be brought out. If the agency were operating in its bad old ways, monitoring telephones, surveilling people illegally, I wouldn't have gotten this far.
You're an arrogant young man, aren't you?
That's the only way you can survive in the CIA, Mike. By being positive, arrogant, and hoping you know where you're going.
We filmed that interview a month ago. We have now checked with most of the principals named by Snepp in his charges of botch and cover-up. Almost all of them describe his allegations as nonsense, and they agree with Henry Kissinger, who calls Snepp, quote, a man at the second level in Saigon, 10,000 miles away from Washington, who could not possibly have had any full understanding and knowledge of what the decisions were and how they were reached. And all the principals we contacted, Kissinger, Ambassador Martin, Colby, CIA Station Chief Polgar, deny blame for the thousands of key Vietnamese who were left behind in jeopardy. One of them put it this way: retreat, he said, is the most difficult maneuver under any conditions, and these were hardly the best of conditions. Having said that, the various principals tended to point the finger of blame at one another. Ambassador Martin repeated his claim that Washington had delayed too long in granting authority to his embassy to evacuate large numbers of Vietnamese. But various of the others criticized Martin's performance. One calls him too strong-willed. Another said he was physically sick toward the end. One called him batty. When asked about it, Ambassador Martin told us, history will vindicate my performance in Vietnam. Henry Kissinger said the administration's plan at the end was to keep pushing the Congress for aid to the South Vietnamese, to keep the Saigon government believing we were working for them, to avoid panic. For the same reason, he says, there was no crash evacuation of Americans, for had too many Americans departed too quickly, there was fear in Washington that the South Vietnamese military would turn their guns on their departing allies. On the matter of Saudi Arabian aid to South Vietnam, it turns out that Kissinger did talk to King Faisal about financial aid. Faisal told Kissinger that South Vietnam would get cut rates on all the oil they needed. To the South Vietnamese, that would have been worth $300 million a year. Kissinger also denies any knowledge of a CIA plan to kidnap North Vietnam's leaders. What would we have done with them if we got them, he asked. On other items, William Colby denies categorically leaking any top-secret material. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker denies having offered General Duong Van Minh $3 million to run for the presidency against General Thieu. Malcolm Brown of the New York Times acknowledges that he carried information from one side to the other in the final days. He says he was probably had, to some degree, by both sides in the chaos at the end. And finally, what about Frank Snepp? CIA Director Stansfield Turner says he has spoken with the Justice Department looking to the possibility of prosecution for Snepp's breaking of his oath of secrecy.